All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Yeah, we're really excited about this one.
This time, you guys have sent in some really, really fascinating stuff, and it all seems to revolve around this idea of expressive arts therapy.
Right.
So we're going to unpack what that is exactly and look at some of the core ideas.
Exactly. And I think a good place to start is with the book that a lot of you sent in, Foundations of Expressive Arts Therapy,
Uh,
Theoretical and Clinical Perspectives.
yeah.
And maybe right off the bat, for anyone listening who's like, wait, what is expressive arts therapy?
Mhm.
The introduction to this book does a nice job of laying it all out.
Oh, okay.
So it's not like those more specialized art therapies you might have heard of, where you're focusing on just one thing like, say, painting or music therapy.
Mhm.
This is more about weaving together different creative outlets.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, so think movement, drawing, painting, sculpting, music, writing, even just sound and improvisation, all in the service of a therapeutic goal.
So it's less about like becoming a master pianist or a brilliant painter and more about the process of making those things as a way to like work through stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the journey, not the destination, as they say.
Now, one thing that struck me as I was looking through this material was how young this field actually is.
Yeah.
It seems like its roots are in like the early 1970s with the expressive therapy program at Lesley College Graduate School,
Hmm.
which by the way is in Cambridge.
Right.
But it's really cool to see how even in that short time, some pretty big names have emerged like Shaun McNiff, Paolo Knill, and Norma Canner.
Oh, absolutely. They were pioneers, really shaping what expressive arts therapy is today.
And what I find really fascinating is where some of the inspiration for this kind of therapy came from.
Oh, yeah.
It's this really interesting blend of, like, on the one hand, you have these ancient traditions like shamanism, indigenous healing practices. And then on the other hand, you've got these contemporary philosophical ideas like phenomenology and hermeneutics, which are, let's be honest, not exactly light reading.
Right, right.
It's this really fascinating mix.
Yeah, it is. And I think for the sake of our deep dive today, what we really want to do is, kind of pull out those core principles, those foundational ideas that underpin all these different expressions and approaches in the field.
Yeah, definitely.
And then, explore the ways in which expressive arts therapy actually gets put to use, right? Like, what does that look like in practice?
Absolutely.
How can it help people in their lives?
So let's jump right in.
Yeah, let's go.
One of the first things that really caught my attention was this idea of like the nature of artistic inquiry, and Shaun McNiff talks about this in his work.
Oh, yeah, he's got some great stuff on that.
Yeah, and what he seems to be saying is that art isn't just about, making something aesthetically pleasing or beautiful.
Right.
It can also be this really powerful way of getting at the truth.
Absolutely. And I think the way he puts it, it's like art becomes a mode of research in itself. Like through that creative process, we're able to gain insights and uncover things about ourselves and the world that we might not necessarily get to just through, thinking or analyzing things intellectually.
It's like another way of knowing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then he poses this really interesting question, which is, what if we saw a future where researchers, people who are investigating all kinds of things, what if they grounded their inquiries more and more in artistic practice?
Wow. Instead of just like the typical scientific method, the purely cognitive stuff.
Exactly.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
It is. It
would
is.
really change how we approach understanding the world.
Yeah, and I think the exciting thing about that is it could potentially bring a lot more vibrancy and imagination back into how we think and engage with knowledge.
I love that.
Yeah.
Now, another really important concept that comes up a lot is this person-centered approach, which some of you may recognize from Carl Rogers.
Oh, yeah. Carl Rogers, the big name in humanistic psychology.
Exactly. And his daughter, Natalie Rogers, actually took that and kind of brought it into this realm of the arts with her idea of the creative connection.
Yeah, she's done some really groundbreaking work.
And it's interesting because what it seems to emphasize is this holistic view. Like using these different art forms in therapy isn't just about addressing one specific issue. It's about aiming for this sense of wholeness, like helping people become their most fully realized selves.
Right. What's often called self-actualization, that drive we all have towards growth and fulfilling our potential.
Exactly.
And the arts really come into play here because they offer such unique ways to express the whole range of what someone's experiencing internally.
Yeah, and if you think about the core principle of the person-centered approach, it's this belief that every human being has this inherent capacity for positive change and growth, as long as the environment they're in is, supportive and nurturing.
A very hopeful view of human nature.
It is.
It's like saying, hey, deep down, we all have what we need to heal and thrive.
And in this context, the therapist isn't so much like an authority figure giving advice, right?
Right.
It's more like they're a companion walking alongside the client on their own journey of self-discovery.
Yeah, and a big part of that is empathy. Really being able to understand and share in the feelings that the client is expressing.
And just witnessing their creative expression, whether it's through movement or making a piece of art.
Yeah, just being present with them in that moment.
And something I found really interesting was this emphasis on letting the artist, the person who created the work, be the first one to talk about it.
Oh, absolutely. That's crucial.
Like, what do they feel it means? What were they experiencing when they made it?
Yeah, because ultimately their interpretation is what matters most.
And the therapist, the facilitator, really respects that.
It's about honoring the client's own understanding of their work, rather than trying to impose any kind of outside analysis or interpretation onto it.
Right.
It's their story to tell.
Now, something else that really stood out to me is that expressive arts therapy doesn't shy away from the harder parts of life, the painful stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And Yakov Nayor's work with the Theater of the Holocaust really dives into that.
Yeah, it's really powerful stuff.
It is. And I think what he's showing us is that theater can be this incredibly powerful container for working through intense conflict and pain, especially when you're talking about trauma with a capital T.
And he specifically worked with children of Holocaust survivors and even children of German parents who lived through World War II.
Yeah, heavy stuff.
It is, but
Yeah.
it's so important to acknowledge and address.
Oh, absolutely.
And what I find so inspiring is that even in the face of something as horrific as the Holocaust, where words often fail, art can offer a way to express and process those really difficult emotions.
It's like giving shape to the unspeakable.
Yeah, I like that.
And similarly, Melinda Ashley Meyer's work with Bosnian exiles in Norway also really speaks to this.
Yeah, I read about her concept of creating a playroom within a waiting room. That really resonated with me.
It's such a powerful image, right?
It is.
Like taking this space that's filled with uncertainty and limbo and transforming it into a place where people can connect, engage, and, start to heal through creative expression.
Yeah, and she talks about how, after experiencing such intense violence and suffering, that ability to play and create can really help people reclaim a sense of agency. Like they're not just passive victims of circumstance, they can actively participate in their own healing.
Right, and it brings them back to the present moment, to the here and now, which can be so grounding after experiencing trauma.
And then there's Ellen G. Levine, who brings in this really interesting element of play.
Oh, yeah, play is so crucial, especially when you're talking about therapy.
She actually connects child psychoanalysis with expressive arts therapy. And what she proposes is that maybe all this therapeutic work that we're talking about, whether it's with children or adults, maybe it all actually takes place within this, playground of the imagination.
I love that idea.
I do too.
It really speaks to the importance of, being able to approach therapy with a sense of openness and curiosity, like a child exploring the world around them.
Yeah, and that sense of playfulness can be so freeing, especially when you're dealing with really heavy stuff.
Absolutely, and I think it really taps into our innate capacity for healing and growth, no matter our age.
I agree.
Because
Laura.
deep down, we all still have that playful child within us, and that's something to nurture and tap into.
So now I kind of want to switch gears a bit and talk about some of the philosophical ideas that come up in the book's introduction.
Yeah, let's get philosophical.
Because, it mentions how the field of expressive arts therapy has this very international feel to it. And it really resonates with this idea from the philosopher Heidegger about the same.
Oh, yeah, Heidegger, he can be a bit dense sometimes, but he's got some really thought-provoking stuff.
He does. And what they're getting at here is how, even though there might be differences in approach and theoretical perspective within expressive arts therapy, there's this underlying sense of a shared understanding of the human experience and the power of creative expression. We're all kind of in this together, even if we come at it from different angles.
It's a beautiful thing, that sense of unity and diversity.
It is.
Like we're all part of the same tapestry, even though our individual threads might be different colors.
Exactly.
And I think that speaks to the inclusiveness of expressive arts therapy.
Yeah.
There's room for all sorts of perspectives and approaches, and that's what makes it so rich.
Now, there's this really interesting contrast that they draw between Plato's view of poets?
Oh, yeah, Plato wasn't exactly a fan of poets, was he?
He wasn't, and the introduction actually mentions this idea of mimesis.
Which basically means imitation, right?
Yeah, and Plato was concerned that poets, through their art, could stir up all kinds of psychological and political disorder.
Right, because he saw art as being twice removed from reality, like a copy of a copy,
So he thought it could be misleading and distract people from the pursuit of true knowledge,
and potentially even lead to, emotional and social instability.
which is so different from how we tend to think about art today.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's partly thanks to, later thinkers like Heidegger who actually put art right at the center of what it means to be human.
Yeah, and for Heidegger, art, or poiesis, as he called it, wasn't just some kind of superfluous extra. It was fundamental to our very existence.
Right, and he saw it as a way of bringing truth into being, not just imitating it.
He actually used this word aletheia to describe truth, which is more like an unconcealing or revealing.
Yeah, it's like through the act of creating, we're actually uncovering something that was already there, but hidden.
And he had this idea that there's this constant interplay between what he called world and earth.
And that art, poiesis, is the process through which that interplay becomes visible.
So it's not just about the individual artist making a thing, it's about this much bigger process of revealing meaning and bringing it into the world.
Exactly, and I think that really resonates with the core philosophy of expressive arts therapy, because it's saying that art is essential. It's not something we could just do without.
Now, I want to talk about Paolo Knill's idea of soul nourishment
Oh, yes, I love his work.
and this idea of the intermodal language of imagination.
Right, it's so rich.
So he's talking about things like movements, words, actions, images, and sound and rhythm, and how all of these can be expressions of our inner world.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found fascinating was his distinction between how imagination manifests in different ways.
Like in our dreams and our daydreams and through art.
Yeah, and he sees dreams as more passive experiences, while daydreaming involves more active thought.
Mm-hmm.
But it's in the artistic process, he says, where we have this most intentional and direct interaction with our imagination because we're actually engaging with physical materials.
That thingliness of art, as he calls it.
Yeah, I love that word.
It's great, isn't it?
And he really emphasizes how this thingliness allows us to create tangible works, oeuvres, that can be shared with others.
Right, and I think that's really important because it allows for a level of communication and connection that might not be possible through words alone.
And, if we think about this in terms of transpersonal theory, which is another idea that comes up in the book,
Mm-hmm.
it suggests that the art we create in therapy can actually have a much broader significance.
Right.
Like, it can connect to rituals and our everyday lives, almost functioning like personal totems or prayers.
Or grounding exercises even.
Yeah, exactly.
Like little reminders of our inner strength and resilience.
And Knill also introduces these concepts of aesthetic responsibility and aesthetic probing in the therapeutic process.
Right, and I think it's important to clarify what those mean because they might sound a bit technical.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
aesthetic responsibility is really about the therapist's deep respect for the integrity of the artwork that's emerging.
So it's not about like judging it or trying to make it better.
Exactly. It's about honoring the client's creative process and allowing the work to unfold organically.
And then aesthetic probing.
Yeah, that's where the therapist might offer gentle suggestions, maybe encouraging the client to try a different material or explore a movement in a new way.
But it's always in service of the artwork itself, not the therapist's own agenda.
Exactly. It's about supporting the emergence of the work rather than directing it.
And Knill actually uses this really beautiful metaphor to describe expressive arts therapy.
Oh, yeah, I love that.
He calls it a dietary and medical practice in the psychic metabolism.
It's so evocative, right?
It is, and he's saying that the art created in that therapeutic relationship actually acts as a kind of soul medicine.
Mm-hmm. Like it can nourish and heal our inner world in the same way that food and medicine nourish and heal our physical bodies.
I love that.
And it really speaks to the power of art to help us regulate our emotions, process difficult experiences, and ultimately move towards a greater sense of well-being.
Now, Mitch Jacoby brings in this really fascinating perspective from the philosopher K.E. Lugstrup.
Lugstrup, yeah, he's not as widely known as some of the others we've talked about.
He's not.
But his work on the connection between ethics and aesthetics is really thought-provoking.
Yeah, and it might seem like a strange pairing at first, ethics and aesthetics.
Right, but what Lugstrup argues is that our human nature has a fundamentally sensory basis.
So we experience the world through our senses, and that shapes how we relate to each other.
Exactly. And he believes that our souls are nourished by the world around us through what we see, hear, touch, smell, taste, all of it.
And he says that this interconnectedness gives rise to what he calls sovereign life utterances.
Which are things like compassion, hope, love, those really powerful, spontaneous expressions of our shared humanity.
Yeah, and he says that these utterances actually need what he calls bound expression or form to survive and thrive in the world.
And that's where things like social rules and artistic forms come into play, because they provide structure and a kind of container for those essential human experiences.
And he even goes so far as to connect this to our ethical responsibility to care for each other, saying that artistic expression allows us to give shape to those sensory experiences in a way that everyday language often can't fully capture.
Right, and I think what's so profound about Legstrup's thinking is that he's saying our creative drive, our need to express ourselves artistically, is inherently linked to both our being in the world and our ethical obligations toward each other.
It's really beautiful when you think about it that way.
It is.
Now, I want to dive into Paul Newham's chapter, which focuses specifically on voice work as an expressive art.
Oh, yes. Voice work's such a powerful modality.
It is, and what he emphasizes is that therapeutic voice work can really unlock the voice, allowing for the expression of this, like, multicolored fabric of the inner self, as he puts it.
I love that imagery, the multicolored fabric.
It's so vivid, right?
It is. And he even goes on to connect vocal sound to the imagery we see in our dreams, suggesting that maybe each part of our inner world has its own unique vocal expression.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It is, and he also highlights how essential vocal expression is for us developmentally, right, from those early sounds of infancy.
Like crying, cooing, babbling.
Yeah, those instinctive sounds that are universally understood.
And he points out how voice work is used in so many different contexts, from music therapy to religious ceremonies to even politics.
Right, because the voice is such a powerful tool for communication and connection.
It is, but he makes a distinction between, those more general uses of voice and what he calls therapeutic voice work.
Which is specifically focused on facilitating deep psychological expression through sound.
And that requires specialized training.
Oh, absolutely, because you're dealing with really sensitive material.
It was also fascinating to learn about how historically song-making and singing have been used in healing ceremonies across cultures.
Oh, yeah, it's a tradition that goes back centuries.
And often those practices were guarded by healers and shamans.
Right. They were seen as sacred and powerful tools for healing.
And then Newham even mentions Jung's observations about how a person's voice can actually change to reflect different aspects of their personality, which is so interesting.
It is, and it suggests that there might be this whole inner dialogue happening within us, expressed through these subtle shifts in our vocal tone and quality.
And he also mentioned some of the work that's been done in theater exploring the nonverbal voice and how educators like F.M. Alexander have looked at the deep connection between posture, breathing, and psychological well-being.
Yeah, it's all interconnected.
It really is.
Our voice, our body, our mind, it's all one system.
Let's go back to Natalie Rogers and her creative connection model.
Okay, back to Audra.
She really emphasizes the use of different art forms within a supportive and safe setting as a way to tap into those deeper emotions and work towards self-discovery. And what she really stresses is that it's the process of creating that matters most, not so much the end product.
Right, it's not about being a good artist or making something perfect.
It's about the journey.
Exactly. And she talks about how this often involves a cyclical process of creating something, whether it's through movement, art, writing, sound, and then sharing about it verbally.
And then reflecting on what that experience was like, which can lead to those aha moments.
Yeah, those moments of insight and self-discovery.
And she shares this really powerful example of Marcia Martin's clay work after doing a guided imagery exercise.
Holding love, right?
Yes.
It's such a beautiful piece, and it really demonstrates how creating art can help us uncover and express emotions that we might not even be consciously aware of.
And Rogers really emphasizes the importance of the therapist creating a safe and non-judgmental space for that kind of deep exploration to happen.
Oh, absolutely. That sense of safety and acceptance is crucial.
And she also talks about how expressive arts can help us move beyond those inner conflicts, those opposing forces within us.
The shadow and the light, as they're often called.
Exactly, and the example of Gerd using movement and painting to explore his right and left sides really brings that to life.
It shows how, through creative expression, we can actually start to integrate those seemingly opposite parts of ourselves and move towards a greater sense of wholeness.
All right, I want to switch gears again and talk about this specific movement-based expressive arts therapy approach that focuses on what are called body stories.
Oh, yes, the body keeps the score, as they say.
It does, and this approach really emphasizes the idea that our emotional and mental responses to life experiences are not just stored in our minds.
Right, they're held within our bodies as well.
And it uses movement metaphors as a way to access and release those experiences.
Yeah, it's a really powerful and embodied way of understanding ourselves.
And the method often involves identifying a specific theme or aspect of the self that the person wants to explore.
Mhm.
And then they create three different self-portraits, a physical one, an emotional one, and a mental one, usually through drawing.
And then those drawings become the starting point for exploring each of those aspects of the self through movement and sound.
And then there's this element of dialogue, often using creative writing or even having dialogues between the drawings themselves.
It sounds really interesting.
It is, and the case study of C and her journey of expressing the anger and fear she felt related to hair loss is a really moving example of how this process can unfold.
Right, because it shows how movement that might initially feel constricted and limited can actually transform into something much more expressive and freeing.
And how connecting those physical expressions with words and sounds can really deepen the emotional release and understanding.
It's a beautiful example of how the body can speak its truth through movement.
Now, Annette Brederode's work in what she calls the art studio offers another really interesting perspective.
Yeah, I was really intrigued by her approach.
It focuses on expressing and making visible those feelings and experiences that haven't yet found their way into words.
The things that are still too difficult or too confusing to articulate verbally.
Exactly, and she talks about how her approach is all about creating the right conditions for each person's unique inner story to emerge.
Hmm.
And she often starts with these undirected physical exercises as a kind of warm-up.
Right, to help people get out of their heads and into their bodies.
And she says that this can actually lead to a state of creative confusion, which might sound counterintuitive.
Yeah, but she sees it as a way to bypass our conscious control and tap into deeper, more intuitive levels of expression.
And then she describes this process of working with finger paint in layers, allowing images to gradually emerge as carriers of memory and facilitators of a healing process.
It's a very organic and intuitive way of working.
And she has this three-phase approach.
Right.
First, there's this initial physical engagement with the materials without any set ideas.
Then there's a deeper working through, where the person starts to engage with the images and emotions that are emerging.
And then finally, there's an emergence towards completion, where the artwork takes on its final form.
And that often leads to a sense of integration and resolution.
And after the painting process, there are often further steps.
Right, like creating a series of unconnected sentences inspired by the images, then writing a short text that connects to them, and then sharing all of that in small groups.
And finally, taking some time to step back from the work and reflect on it from a new perspective.
It's a really comprehensive approach.
And she really emphasizes the importance of speaking with and through the images rather than just talking about them.
Yeah, to allow for a more direct and immediate emotional connection to the artwork.
And the dialogue example involving the tooth image is a great illustration of how that can work in practice.
It really shows how, by engaging with the image directly, the person is able to access and process deeper layers of meaning and emotion.
Now, I want to touch on expressive music therapy.
Oh, yes, music. Such a universal language.
It is, and as the name suggests, this approach uses instruments and the voice as tools for self-expression.
And it can range from more structured activities, like singing meaningful songs or playing within a specific musical framework.
To a more open-ended approach called spontaneous music making.
Right, where the focus is on letting the sounds themselves create a kind of dialogue, giving form to our internal states without any preconceived ideas.
And then there's receptive music therapy, which focuses on listening to music as a way to evoke feelings, sensations, memories, associations, all of that.
And that can involve listening to personally meaningful music. Or one person might tell a story through music for a group.
Or it could involve guided imagery with music.
It's a really versatile modality.
It is, and the case study of Susanna and her journey through music therapy is a really powerful example of how both receptive and expressive approaches can work together.
Yeah, it's a beautiful illustration of how music can help us access and process really deep and complex emotions, even when words fail.
Margareta Werja then explores this really interesting idea of music as fulfilling a mothering function.
Oh, yes. the nurturing and holding qualities of music.
She talks about how music can provide a kind of containing space for our feelings, especially in situations where early nurturing experiences might have been lacking.
Hmm.
And she connects this to Winnicott's concept of the transitional space, which is that intermediary area where we can play and experiment and develop our sense of self.
Yeah, that space between me and not me.
And she shares these really compelling case studies, one of Thomas, the musician who was struggling with performance anxiety and panic attacks.
And Lars, who had been nonverbal for over a decade due to institutionalization.
And both of their stories really demonstrate how expressive arts therapy, including music, could help them connect with their needs and find new ways to communicate.
And Warja also talks about how music can become a space for transference to occur.
Meaning that clients might start to project their feelings and relationship patterns onto the therapist within the musical interaction.
Right, which can be a really valuable opportunity to explore and work through those patterns in a safe and contained way.
Now let's talk about the power of poetry.
Oh yes, poetry, the language of the soul.
And the book explores this idea of the poetic experience as something that can really move us and leave us in awe.
Hmm.
It's that feeling of being touched by something deeper than words, of having words given to experiences that often feel inexpressible.
And it emphasizes how poetry needs to be spoken, heard, performed to really come alive.
And they connect this poetic experience to a sense of astonishment, which they see as the beginning of wisdom and a feeling of connection to all of life.
Right, it's like that moment when we're suddenly struck by the beauty and wonder of the world around us.
And poetry can evoke those feelings of love and beauty, and it can also broaden our perspectives, offering glimpses of insight and a way of seeing the world that's both comforting and confronting.
And the example poem about emptying oneself really captures that beautifully.
It does, and the book also mentions how using names and acrostic poems in therapy groups can be a gentle way to encourage self-expression and connection.
Yeah, it's a nice way to ease people into the creative process.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about therapeutic theater and psychodrama.
All right, let's set the stage.
These are presented as really powerful ways to break silences and share deeply personal stories.
Especially in the context of trauma, like the Holocaust.
And the book talks about how these modalities can help people confront difficult past experiences and unconscious identifications, and they can help to break the illusion that the past is still alive within us, separate from our memories.
Right, because trauma can often feel like it's happening in the present moment, even though it's long over.
And they highlight the work of Professor Dan Baron with descendants of Nazi perpetrators in Germany.
Which is really interesting because it shows how this kind of work can be relevant even for those who weren't direct victims of trauma.
And they emphasize the healing power of theater as a kind of ritual, creating a safe space to explore those difficult emotions and ultimately move towards a sense of catharsis and integration.
And they share some really powerful examples like Harold, the German professor, and his psychodrama involving the baby bird and the Jewish girl.
And Tony's psychodrama, where he does this role reversal with his father.
Yeah, and both of those examples really illustrate how psychodrama can help to unlock those hidden emotions and bring them into the light of awareness.
And they also talk about the use of playback theater, where stories are enacted spontaneously for the teller, and nonverbal movement exploration. And they touch on the unique challenges faced by the desert generation, the children of Holocaust survivors, and their role as living reminders and bearers of unspoken grief.
It's a really important topic to address.
It is.
Because that intergenerational transmission of trauma is something that can have a profound impact on families and communities.
Finally, I want to talk about Melinda Ashley Meyer's chapter, In Exile from the Body.
Oh, yes, that's a powerful one.
It explores this really profound consequence of experiencing severe trauma like torture and violence, where people can actually feel disconnected from their own bodies.
Almost like they've shut down their senses as a way to protect themselves.
Exactly. And she talks about how even the experience of pain, which we often try to avoid, can be a way of confirming that we're alive. And she emphasizes the role of the therapist in helping survivors find their way back to feeling at home in their bodies and to express their pain through the arts.
Because art can engage all of our senses and provide a way for the witness, the therapist, to really take in what's being communicated.
And she shares this powerful example of creating a playroom out of a waiting room with Bosnian exiles.
Using movement and play to help them reconnect with the present moment.
And she also talks about the importance of group rituals in creating a sense of safety and predictability,
Hmm.
which is so crucial when you're dealing with the aftermath of trauma.
Absolutely, because trauma often shatters our sense of safety and makes the world feel unpredictable.
And the psychodrama of Neela symbolically meeting her father in prison and on a mountain is a really powerful example of how this kind of work can help people explore complex family dynamics and deeply held emotions.
It shows how, even in the face of immense pain and loss, there's still a possibility for healing and reconciliation.